Hello! Today we will review how to punctuate dialogue correctly. The first thing to keep in mind is that most of the time end punctuation will go inside the final quotation marks, unless the entire sentence is a question. We will get to that in the third bullet. Notice that commas and periods will always go inside the final quotation marks. Taking a look at example number 1, "You forgot me," he wailed. The quotation is at the beginning of the sentence and then the speaker and the verb. Because the end of the sentence isn't until after the verb, that's where the period goes. We use commas in dialogue to indicate the end of the quoted sentence, but not the end of the entire sentence. So the other thing to notice, like I said earlier, is that this comma is going to stay inside the quotation marks. I like to think of the commas and the periods and other end punctuation as people and the quotation marks as their house, and they like to stay nice and warm and dry inside their house. Example number 2 just reverses the speaker and the verb with the quoted sentence. So the speaker, she, and the verb thought come before the quoted sentence, "Volleyball is my life." Because the quoted sentence is after the speaker and the verb, we will use the period because it's the end of the entire sentence. The period does stay nice and warm inside those quotation marks. The same rule of keeping the punctuation inside the quotation marks applies when we are using exclamation points and question marks with the quoted sentence. So for example, "My goodness," she shouted. We have an excitement here in the "my goodness," so we want to use the exclamation point to show that excitement. It does come inside those quotation marks. Same with the question. Tilly asked, "Do you have gym class today?" "Do you have gym class today" is a question. The question mark is going to go inside those quotation marks. Notice there is no additional punctuation. The question mark in this example and the exclamation point in the above example are the only punctuation we use. Later, we'll get to the idea that we don't use more than one end punctuation point for any quoted sentences. The exception of punctuation coming inside the quotation mark happens only when the entire sentence is a question. So in this example, who said, "Life is like a box of chocolates"? The entire sentence works together as a question. "Life is like a box of chocolates" is a statement. It's not a question like, "Do you have gym class today?" Therefore, the question mark goes outside of the quotation marks because together with the speaker and the verb, "who said," the entire sentence acts as a question. I mentioned earlier that we never want to use more than one end punctuation mark in dialogue. So we would never ask a question and then put the comma, then the end quotation marks. So we have that in red because we want to stop. We don't want to ever do that. But here it is correctly. "Can you believe it?" Tom asked. Notice we get rid of that extra comma. It is unnecessary and it's incorrect. Sometimes you might want to put a quotation within a quotation. And in that case, you're going to use single quotation marks. Here is an example. "Morgan complained, 'I dislike when Sarah says,'" right on, dude. Notice that we have the single quotation marks inside the double quotation marks. Sometimes we might have something called broken quotations. This is when you split sentences into two parts and put the speaker and the verb in the middle. Authors do this to vary their sentence structure, add a little bit of variety, and it is a good technique to use. In order to punctuate it correctly, you need to remember that the whole sentence is just one sentence, and so we're only going to have the end punctuation at the very end. So let's take a look at this one. This first example: when revising your essay, comma, Ms. High instructed, double check that you punctuated your dialogue correctly. Can you tell what this clause is when revising your essay? Correct. It is a subordinating clause. When is your subordinating conjunction? When revising your essay cannot stand alone. It depends on the second independent clause. Double check that you punctuated your dialogue correctly. Therefore, we only have one complex sentence here, but we put the speaker and the verb in the middle. So we're going to use these commas to let our audience know there's some pausing to be done. When revising your essay, Ms. High instructed, double check that you punctuated your dialogue correctly. Example number 2. Take extra clothes on the hike, Ranger Bob instructed, because the terrain is wet and muddy. Take extra clothes on the hike is a complete sentence. The subject is you understood, and the verb is take. However, because the terrain is wet and muddy is not. Do you recognize the word because? What part of speech is because? If you said a conjunction, you are correct. Because is a subordinating conjunction like when, and therefore cannot stand alone. So that is why we need to make sure that it is lowercase. It is part of this first part of the sentence. Take extra clothes on the hike because the terrain is wet and muddy. Moving along, we'll talk about capitalization in dialogue. You will always want to capitalize the first word after the quotation marks if it begins a new sentence. So for example, my sister-in-law demanded, "We're going to the Bahamas for vacation." "We're going to the Bahamas for vacation" is a complete sentence. We have a subject, we, the verb are going, and a complete thought. Therefore, we must capitalize the beginning of that sentence, the W in we're. We have to keep in mind what happens when we have a pronoun at the end of the quoted sentence. We're not going to capitalize that pronoun because it's part of the whole sentence. So for example, if we have "Walk please, Whitney shouted," everybody knows we need to capitalize Whitney because it's a proper noun. It doesn't matter where the word Whitney comes in any sentence. Names are always capitalized. However, when we're using a pronoun like she, it is not capitalized because it is not a proper noun. So we would say, "Walk please," exclamation point, she shouted. She not being capitalized. We're going to use the lowercase s. Another thing to keep in mind is that when we're using an indirect quotation or a rewording of a direct quotation, we do not use quotation marks. So a direct quotation would be, Tom predicted it will be a close game. It will be a close game are Tom's direct words. However, if we said Tom predicted that it would be a close game, these aren't his specific words, therefore we do not use quotation marks. The conjunction that, the relative pronoun that right here, is indicating that these are not word for word out of Tom's mouth, and therefore we're not going to put quotation marks around those words. Finally, the last thing that I want you to keep in mind when you punctuate dialogue is that every new speaker begins a new paragraph. If you take a look at any of your fiction books and you find a conversation between two characters, you will see that every time the new character speaks, they get their very own new paragraph. You'll need to do that as well in your own writing. Good luck, and keep in mind these rules when punctuating dialogue.